The necklace looked worthless. That was the first thing everyone in the room seemed to agree on. It hung quietly against the young woman's faded blue dress, its uneven silver beads catching the cold light of the luxury jewelry store. One side of the chain was slightly thicker than the other. The pendant was small, handmade, and imperfect. There was no famous designer stamp, no velvet presentation box, no glittering diamond large enough to attract attention from across the room. And yet, when the jeweler reached for the clasp, his fingers suddenly stopped. His face changed. The amusement disappeared from his eyes. His breathing became shallow. He leaned closer, turned the necklace over, and stared at a tiny mark hidden beneath the clasp. Then the elderly jeweler looked at the woman as though he had just seen a ghost. The wealthy customers who had been laughing moments earlier slowly stopped smiling. Because the necklace they had called cheap was not what it appeared to be. And the woman wearing it had no idea that the little piece of jewelry around her neck was about to uncover a secret that had been buried for more than 20 years. If you believe that kindness can change a person's life, that second chances matter, and that we should never judge someone by what they wear or what they can afford, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps us bring more stories of courage, kindness, and unexpected second chances. Her name was Elena, and at 32 years old, she had become very good at pretending she was not tired. She pretended when she woke before sunrise to prepare breakfast for her 8-year-old daughter. She pretended when she counted the remaining money in her wallet before buying groceries. She pretended when her landlord reminded her that the rent was already 5 days late. She pretended when her daughter asked why they could not replace the old winter coat with the broken zipper. Most of all, she pretended when people looked at her worn shoes, faded clothes, and inexpensive jewelry and assumed they already knew everything about her. Elena had learned early in life that poverty was not only about having less money. Sometimes it was about having to explain yourself to people who had never needed to understand. She lived with her daughter, Mia, in a small second-floor apartment above an old bakery on the quieter side of the city. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, although one was so small that Elena had turned it into Mia's room while sleeping on a narrow sofa in the living room. The paint around the windows was beginning to peel, and the heating system made strange noises whenever the temperature dropped. But Elena kept the place clean. There were small plants on the windowsill. Mia's drawings covered one wall. A faded photograph of Elena's mother sat beside the kitchen clock. And above the tiny dining table hung a wooden shelf filled with little handmade objects that Elena had created over the years. She had always made things with her hands. When Elena was a child, her mother had taught her how to repair old clothing, reshape broken buttons, weave thread, and polish pieces of discarded metal. Her mother had possessed almost nothing of material value, but she had possessed patience. She used to tell Elena that beautiful things did not always begin beautifully. Sometimes they began as broken pieces. Sometimes they began as mistakes. Sometimes they began as things other people had thrown away. Elena never forgot that. After her mother died, Elena discovered that working with her hands helped silence the loneliness. She began making bracelets, small pendants, earrings, and necklaces from inexpensive materials. She never considered herself a professional jeweler. She simply loved creating things. Then, after Mia was born, handmade jewelry became more than a hobby. It became survival. Elena sold small pieces at weekend markets and online. She never earned much, but every few dollars helped. A bracelet could mean milk for 2 days. A pair of earrings could pay for school supplies. A necklace could sometimes cover part of the electricity bill. But there was one necklace she never sold. The necklace she was wearing that morning. It had belonged to her mother. At least, that was what Elena believed. She had received it when she was 11 years old, shortly before her mother became seriously ill. The necklace looked strange compared with modern jewelry. It was made from tiny silver-colored links, with a modest oval pendant in the center. It had clearly been repaired several times. The clasp was especially unusual. It looked handmade. Her mother had always told her never to lose it. Elena never asked why. For 21 years, she had kept the necklace safe. On the morning everything changed, Elena wore it because she had an important appointment. A wealthy jewelry company in the city was hosting a private artisan showcase. Elena had been invited after one of her handmade pieces caught the attention of an organizer at a local market. She had been nervous for weeks. The showcase was being held inside one of the most prestigious jewelry stores in the city. The kind of place Elena had only ever seen from outside. The windows displayed watches that cost more than her apartment. The walls were decorated with elegant artwork. Employees wore tailored suits and spoke softly to customers who arrived in expensive cars. Elena almost turned around when she reached the entrance. She looked down at her shoes. They were clean but old. She looked at her blouse. It had been carefully ironed, but the fabric was thin. Then she touched the necklace. Her mother's necklace. For some reason, it made her feel brave. She walked inside. At first, nobody paid much attention to her. Then they noticed the jewelry she had brought. Elena carried a small wooden case containing 12 handmade pieces. None were diamonds. None were made of rare gemstones. But each piece had been carefully designed and polished by hand. A young couple standing nearby glanced at the case. The woman smiled faintly. The man leaned toward her and whispered something. Elena could not hear the words. She did not need to. She knew that expression. It was the expression people wore when they had already decided something about you. A few minutes later, another customer noticed Elena's necklace. It happened casually. A woman in an expensive cream-colored dress looked at it and laughed softly. She asked Elena where she had bought it. Elena explained that it had belonged to her mother. The woman examined it from a distance and smiled. She said it looked like something purchased at a roadside craft stall. Another person nearby laughed. Soon, the necklace had become entertainment. Someone pointed out that the clasp looked uneven. Someone else joked that perhaps Elena had made it herself from scrap metal. A younger woman said that handmade was one thing, but wearing something so obviously cheap into a luxury jewelry store was another. Elena stood still. She felt her face becoming warm. She wanted to explain. She wanted to tell them that the necklace was not supposed to impress anyone. She wanted to tell them that it had survived 21 years. That her mother had touched that clasp with her own fingers. That she had worn it when she was 11 and terrified of losing the only person in the world who made her feel safe. But she said nothing, because she had learned that some people did not want explanations. They wanted superiority. So Elena simply lowered her eyes. The cruelest part was not the laughter. It was the way people laughed without wondering whether there was a story behind the thing they were mocking. Then an elderly man approached. His name was Arthur Bennett. For more than 40 years, Arthur had been a master jeweler. He had repaired royal heirlooms, restored antique watches, appraised rare gemstones, and worked with families whose jewelry had been passed down through generations. He had seen almost everything. But he had never seen the necklace Elena was wearing. At least, not recently. Arthur had been watching from across the room. He noticed something others had missed. The clasp. He asked Elena if he could examine it. She hesitated. Then she carefully removed the necklace and placed it in his hand. Arthur turned it over. His expression changed immediately. He used a small magnifying glass. He checked the clasp. Then the back of the pendant. Then the tiny hinge. His hands began to tremble. He looked at Elena. He asked where she had gotten it. She explained that it belonged to her mother and that she had owned it since childhood. Arthur became very quiet. He looked again at the clasp. There, hidden beneath a layer of oxidation and decades of wear, was a tiny symbol. A symbol so small that most people would never notice it. Arthur knew it. He had seen it only once before. 26 years earlier. And that memory came back so suddenly that he had to sit down. Years ago, Arthur had worked for a renowned jeweler named Samuel Reed. Samuel had been famous for creating custom pieces for wealthy families. But there was one particular project he had refused to discuss publicly. A necklace. It had been commissioned by a man named Daniel Whitmore, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the region. Daniel had wanted to create something for his wife after the birth of their daughter. The necklace was supposed to be a family heirloom. But something went wrong. Before the necklace could be delivered, Daniel and his wife were involved in a devastating accident. Their infant daughter survived. Their family, however, was torn apart. Arthur remembered the chaos that followed. The necklace disappeared. Everyone assumed it had been lost. Samuel had searched for it for years. But he never found it. Arthur looked at Elena again. His voice was barely audible when he asked her mother's name. Elena told him. Arthur froze. Because he knew that name too. Not as the owner of the necklace. But as the young woman who had once worked inside Samuel's workshop. A young woman who had disappeared from the city shortly after the accident. A young woman who had been accused of stealing something extremely valuable. A young woman who had always insisted she had taken nothing. Elena's mother. Arthur's heart began pounding. The room suddenly felt smaller. He asked Elena how her mother had acquired the necklace. Elena explained that her mother had never talked much about her past. She had only said that she had been given the necklace under complicated circumstances and that one day Elena would understand why it mattered. Arthur closed his eyes. The woman who had been mocked for wearing a cheap necklace was carrying something that could rewrite the history of a family. But there was still one question. Why had Elena's mother possessed it? Arthur asked to inspect the clasp more closely. He carefully opened the tiny mechanism. Inside was a hidden compartment. Everyone around them leaned closer. Arthur removed a microscopic metal insert. Beneath it was a sequence of engraved numbers. He recognized them. They were not a serial number. They were a date, and a set of initials. Arthur knew exactly what they meant. The necklace had not been stolen. It had been hidden, and the person who hid it had done so to protect someone. Arthur asked Elena if her mother had ever told her about a baby. Elena's expression changed. She remembered something. When Elena was young, her mother had sometimes looked at an old newspaper clipping kept inside a locked wooden box. Elena had never been allowed to touch it. She remembered seeing a photograph once. A wealthy couple, a newborn baby, and a headline about a tragic accident. Her mother had cried whenever she looked at it. Elena had always assumed the story was unrelated to their family. Now she wasn't so sure. Arthur asked whether she still had the wooden box. Elena did. It was in her apartment. But there was another problem. Her mother had died 8 years earlier. And Elena had spent all those years believing she knew who her mother was. Suddenly, she realized she might not know her story at all. Arthur offered to accompany her. They left the jewelry store together. The same people who had laughed earlier now stood silently watching them leave. Outside, the city moved normally. Cars passed. People hurried along the sidewalk. A delivery truck stopped at the corner. Nobody knew that Elena's entire understanding of her life had just begun to collapse. When they reached her apartment, Elena took Arthur to the small bedroom where she kept her mother's belongings. From beneath the bed, she pulled out an old wooden box. The box was scratched and dusty. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were photographs, letters, a hospital bracelet, an old employee identification card, and the newspaper clipping. Arthur looked at it. His face became pale. The photograph showed Daniel Whitmore and his wife. The article explained that they had been killed in a highway accident. Their newborn daughter had survived. But the child had disappeared from the hospital before authorities could locate her extended family. The case had become a mystery. Arthur looked at Elena. The room went silent. Elena felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. Arthur explained what he remembered. The young woman who had worked for Samuel had been at the hospital that night. She had found the baby alone after a terrible mistake in the confusion following the accident. The baby had been weak and critically ill. The young woman had taken responsibility for her temporarily. But when she tried to contact the authorities, she discovered that someone was attempting to hide the truth. She had been warned to stay silent. She had been accused of stealing the necklace. Then she disappeared. Arthur had always believed that she had run away. But now he understood. She had protected the child. She had taken the necklace because it was the only evidence that could eventually prove the child's identity. That child was Elena. Elena stared at him. She could not breathe. For 32 years, she had believed she was simply the daughter of a poor woman who had struggled to survive. But she was not. She was the missing daughter of Daniel Whitmore. The family who had owned one of the largest jewelry companies in the country. The family whose fortune had passed into the hands of distant relatives after the accident. The family whose estate had spent decades believing there was no surviving heir. Elena did not know whether to cry or laugh. The discovery did not feel like a miracle. It felt painful, because suddenly every difficult year had a different meaning. Her mother had not hidden the truth because she was ashamed of Elena. She had hidden it because she had been protecting her. She had worked exhausting jobs. She had lived in tiny apartments. She had repaired clothing late at night. She had skipped meals. She had done everything possible to give Elena a normal childhood. And she had never once told Elena that she had saved her from a life she might never have survived. Arthur spent the next several weeks verifying the evidence. The clasp was examined by specialists. The engraving was authenticated. Old workshop records were located. Hospital documents were reopened. The photographs were compared. The dates matched. The signatures matched. The necklace matched. And eventually, DNA testing confirmed what the historical evidence had already suggested. Elena was Daniel Whitmore's daughter. She was the missing heir. But the most powerful moment came when Elena discovered the final letter. It had been hidden beneath the bottom of the wooden box. Her mother had written it years before her death. She had known that one day Elena might discover the truth. The letter explained everything. She had not wanted Elena to grow up surrounded by wealth. She had wanted her to grow up surrounded by love. She wrote that money could buy comfort, but it could not buy character. She said Elena's worth had never depended on her family name. And then she wrote something Elena would remember for the rest of her life. She said that if the truth ever came out, Elena should not use it to become better than anyone else.